Hey everyone, Seth at Hub City Vintage, and today I thought we might take a closer look at one of my personal favorites, the Seiko Navigator timer. It is a GMT model, and this one in particular is the Seiko 6117-6410, and frankly, most of our videos have revolved so far around watches that needed a bit more help than this one. And as you can see, this is a pretty stunning example of a Seiko Navigator timer. But I will admit, when I am on the hunt for these inner bezel models, pretty much anything with an inner bezel, I am very particular about what I buy, because these inner bezels, you can see the red and blue blocks here. Of course, the printing there and the luminous pip. Anything with a painted inner bezel, they are pretty fragile. You have to be very careful. The paint is delicate. It's easy to chip off if you're not careful and paying attention to what you're doing. And that's the same for pretty much any of these Seiko models that have a painted inner bezel. Probably most notorious is the Regatta timer. The paint on that one is like butterfly wings. I mean, if you just touch it, it's going to come off. So if this one looks to be in a bit better shape and in need of much less help than what we normally share, that's why I think that you should definitely, if you're looking for a Navigator timer or anything with an inner bezel, first and foremost buy the nicest aesthetic example that you can. Of course, that's true for many vintage watches and watches in general. Buy the best looking example that you can find, and then go from there. Any of the movement components can always be repaired or replaced if need be. But that said, this is a stunning example. It comes to us from April of 1971, late enough to be a resist model, as you can see here, water resistant. And again, that's denoted on the dial as well, water 70 meter resist, and of course a Suwa design. As I mentioned here, this is just an absolutely fantastic example. Really, if you just threw a fresh crystal on this one, you'd go a long way into finishing up any sort of restoration. The dial is absolutely clean. You can see the markers are nice and bright white, maybe a bit of color there on the 12 o'clock, but not much in the way of patina. Even in the hands, the luminous windows there, and the pip on the GMT, that dogleg GMT, is not missing any paint. Truly just a fantastic example. This is what you should be looking for. This one checks all the boxes. As it's a 71, these earlier 6117-64s had a polished finish case. So this case has not been polished. You can see nice sharp lines on the case beveling there, and all these corners. They're really nice and crisp. Of course, later they did swap that over to a circular brush finish on the top part of the mid case. The bezel remained polished, but even here you can see the bezel has nice crisp corners, and the beveling there is really, really sharp as well. So a beautiful example of a Navigator timer, and I thought we could maybe talk about some history of Seiko's Navigator timer series, their GMTs as a whole. We're going to lump the World Time in to that as well, because it's basically a very similar design, and it's basically they're the same other than in name and function. As far as how the bezel is used, this is going to give you a second time zone, whereas the World Time gives you time anywhere in the world, but through the use of the same movement, same 24 extra fourth hand there, the 24-hour hand. So if we really take a look at the history of Seiko's GMT models, the World Time came along first. And of course that makes sense, because in 1964, Tokyo hosted the Olympics, and Seiko was the official timekeeper, and that was when they gave the world the first Seiko World Time, the 6217 7000s, and they were beautiful watches. Really just a phenomenal movement, a phenomenal job on the case and the design. Olympics colors, red, white, and blue. Just a great watch all the way around, and if you can get your hands on one, do it. But that 6217 also was shared by a diver's watch. And there's been a very close relation between Seiko's GMT models and divers throughout the history of both lines. The lineage has been a shared one since the beginning. That first World Time, 6217, also shared that movement with the 6217 8000, the 62 Moss, as it's more commonly known. Their first real diver, the first diver rated to 150 meters, and clearly a Seiko grail for many people. But those watches shared that, in fact, that 6217 movement was nearly identical between the two, other than the addition on the upper side of that 24-hour hand wheel, that fourth wheel for this red hand here, the GMT hand. Very closely related movements, and if we look back at Seiko's first Navigator timer, even the 6117 8000, that watch looks a lot like the 6106 sport divers of that same era, that late 60s, 67, 68, 69. And I think that really has more to do with the fact that those early 6106 divers had rotating bezels on the outside. It was very easy to just, instead of having a count up minute or second outer bezel, they were just able to put a 24-hour schematic on that bezel, and with that fourth hand, boom, instant GMT. And of course, that's a beautiful watch, charcoal gray sunburst with that. It's just a beautiful monochromatic layout with that one spot of red. The GMT hand is a little bit different. It's a bit stubbier, and I believe that the triangle, the cursor, is a little bit larger on that one as well. In fact, I may even pull one of those hands out if I've got one. We'll take a look in a bit. But it has a short, stubbier hand on that 6117, but as much as it might look like those early 6106 divers, it actually is much more closely related from a movement standpoint to the Willards, the 6105, 8000, and 8110. Like the Willards, you had that earlier 6105A variant followed up by a B, which added hacking, and the 6117 is the same way. The earlier 6117 Navigator timer did not have hacking seconds. Of course, that was something they added. Very similarly operated to, in fact, it's identically operated with the same lever that takes care of the hacking feature on the 6117B. So as much as that might look like the 6106 divers, it's really much more closely related to the Willard. And when we get to the calendar side of this movement, I can show you, you'll see it's not operated like the 6106, where we have a press quick set for the date, and in later versions of the 6106, the day as well. This one features a, let's get the times okay, that's going to be 8 a.m. It is a rolling quick set, just like the 6105. Clockwise rotation advances the date, and of course that's the same on the Willard. There is no day on either of those watches, just a date only, and it's the very same calendar mechanism from those 6105 movements. But, GMTs as a whole, really, they're just a very useful watch. If you're into watches, you probably have one or want one. Pilot's watches are always a great addition to any collection because they usually offer some nice visibility. They're very utilitarian, great tool watches. And when, of course, color is added, red and blue seems to be the standard set by Father Rolex. And, of course, in its relation to Pan Am and its history there, others followed suit, Seiko included, to use red and blue for the day and night indicators. One thing I will say about Seiko's history with GMTs, now we will say the GMT Master is a benchmark. It is what everyone strove to accomplish in all of their efforts. They wanted something to compete with that watch. It was number one on the leaderboard. And of course, once the GMT Master 2 came out in 1983 with an independently set GMT hand, well, that was the game over. Once they added that feature, it was pretty much the be-all, end-all. But we cannot forget, as much as those watches might strive, other watches might strive to look like the GMT Master 2, I'm going to go ahead and say Seiko beat them to the punch with a independent quick set of the 24-hour hand with a little watch that's not very commonly known. If you go back through the archives on our page, you can see a couple we've had in the last few months. In 1973, Seiko released the Duo Time, which was actually a 56, a way different caliber movement, much more closely related to King Seiko and Grand Seiko and the Lord Maddox. It was a 5619, which had an independently quick set 24-hour hand as well as the date, and it's just a beautiful watch. And of course, that watch being released in 1973 put Seiko about 10 years ahead of Rolex on that technology, on devising a quick set for the GMT hand. So to each his own, but I think if we're going to talk about history there, we should at least give Seiko their credit. One of the reasons I love this brand is they really have never stopped giving us R&D into making watches better. And like Rolex, all of their manufacturing is vertically integrated. You know, back when these watches were being built, Seiko built everything. They made their own crystals and stems, crowns, gaskets, cases, all of it, hands, everything was made by Seiko. And so as such, you know, strict tolerances could be enforced and required, and everything fits so nicely on these watches. They're so precisely engineered, just like a Rolex, for the same reason, vertical integration in the manufacturing process. It's an important thing to remember. And of course, Japan, Seiko there being an island, it was much easier. Rather than to pull resources from around the world, they just decided we're going to just make everything. And it was to their benefit, certainly, and to yours as a watch owner. It's hard to beat watches that are built completely in-house. All that said, let's jump into this GMT Navigator timer and take a look at why it's so great. And let's just go ahead and strip this one down. We're gonna get the case back off here and get this dial out onto the, or get the movement out onto a holder and get these hands off, and we'll start tearing it down and seeing what it looks like. All right, here we go. With the case back off, we can see our movement here. Here on the auto wind bridge, you can see 6117B, as this one is a, what did we say again, 71. That's right. It is going to house the B movement. All of this particular style of the Navigator timer had the B variant, which also gives us our hacking seconds. The balance is moving a little bit there, but you can see if we pull the crown out, it's going to stop. There's a little leg that's attached. Basically, it sits in the same channel as the detent on the stem, and when you pull that stem out, it rocks that leg out to stop the balance. But everything looks right here. I'm kind of getting a first look at this one with you as well. Don't see a lot in the way of rotor rub. Balance looks good. Spinning a little slowly, but the watch isn't wound very much. This is a 17 jewel movement. And I have to say, other than some dirt there, I don't see much in the way of corrosion. It looks like our gasket, yeah, it's still attached to the case back, but it is there, and it looks like it's done its job. You can see where it's become dried and brittle. Some of it has stuck to the inner channel of the mid case here. But let's get this rotor and auto wind off, and then we'll go ahead and take this one out of the case and get it into a movement holder. With the auto wind removed, and I went ahead and removed the balance as well, so we don't have to worry about anything happening with that while we have it in the holder. We're just going to go ahead and pull the stem and crown, and then we'll get this out of the case and in the holder. Quickly though, it might be worth talking about, if you have any of these vintage Seiko models with a rotating inner bezel, it works a bit like this. Oh, it looks like we don't have a gasket on our crown, and that would explain why that bezel was turning so freely in there so easily. A lot of the resistance from that bezel is given by the resistance of the gasket against the inside of the crown tube. So I thought that was turning quite easily, but it doesn't matter. We'll get that set up. Doesn't look like it would have caused any harm so far, but that's all right. We'll make sure we take care of that. All right. So if we take a look here, we can see how this works. How the internal bezel is able to be rotated, where the crown is attached to the stem. You can see that there is a gear that sits on a keyed portion of the stem. The stem actually is round here, but where the stem is, let's see if I can get close enough to show you how that works. So if we pull this little stem back, you should be able to see that beneath it, it's actually square. The gear has a square shaped, a keyed hole in it, and it sits on this keyed part of the stem, and this spring allows it to not be shoved into the delicate plastic teeth of the gear that it aligns with to rotate on the underside of that bezel. This is the 71, so later Seiko went to a one-piece inner bezel, where the teeth were just built right onto the bottom of the bezel. But these earlier models, and this one probably most likely, has a two-piece where you have a toothed ring, and then the bezel sits on top of it, and there's again a small keyed section that allows them to be aligned and fit together like a puzzle piece. But this spring, gives some release, so that when you push the crown and stem back in, you're not just forcing this gear to meet with those teeth. That little bit of freedom of movement there allows it to kind of stay back in place until it naturally falls in line and is able to slip easily past those teeth, where then those teeth sit into these gears, and as you turn your crown, it sends the bezel around in either direction around the dial. And so that's how that works. You get a lot of questions about that, and maybe why it can be expensive to replace these assemblies, because these gears can be difficult to find. There are a couple of aftermarket replacements out there that are worthwhile. And even harder, these springs can be very difficult to find as well. But you want to make sure you're getting everything that you should. You want to make sure there's going to be a snug fit with the gasket inside of the crown tube, and then of course that your gear sits correctly on that keyed stem. All right, well that's the stem and gear and spring assembly and crown in a nutshell. This one looks to be in good working order. I don't think we'll have any issues just reinstalling it once we're done and getting it cleaned up. With the movement in the holder here, we get a much better look at this dial and can really see that, yes, it's just a beautiful dial all the way around. Don't see any fading in the color or any blemishes on the dial. It looks to be very, very clean. Really just what you hope for when you're looking for a Navigator timer. I have no complaints here. Let's get these hands aligned and get them removed, and then we'll get this dial off and take a look at the calendar side of this movement. Typically the way I'd remove these hands is to just remove the hour, minute, and second first with a Presto style hand remover, and then we'll just use lifters to remove the GMT hand, as it has this much wider base, and you can see it sits very close to the dial, and rather than risk damaging the dial, we'll just be very careful in removing that one. So we'll get the hour, minute, and second off first, and then come back for the GMT hand. There's a bit of haziness on the hour and minute hands that I think will likely clean off, and we'll be able to restore that nice mirror finish as we've been able to do in the past. But I really like for those hands to shine nice and bright when they can, to be able to see the beveling and just to have them look their best. So we'll do our best to get rid of that haziness that you see along the tail there. Don't see a lot in the way of scratching or damage, so I think we're in good shape here. Hands removed, that dial looks very nice. I think this is going to be a beautiful watch. All right, let's go ahead and get the dial off and we'll take a look at the calendar side. Here we can see the calendar side of the movement, and as you can see, it's very, very similar to the 6105 if you've seen one of those before. But something interesting, I know I've mentioned in the past, I always like to try to see how closely the production date of the dial relates to the case back, but often, for whatever reason, it may have been cleaned and removed, or may just not have been stamped. This dial on the back does not appear to have a production date stamp, but of course it's a resist case back and a resist dial. Within reason, they're going to be, those production dates would be very close anyway, so no production date stamp. But this is a good example of getting to see that it's not always there. And that's most of the calendar side components. You can see here the keyless works, and of course our quick set rockers. Basically, it's like looking at a 6105. Very similar with this large rocker here and our date rocker that advances the wheel. Let's see, I think I can show you kind of when we move into the various positions. This rocker is going to change its position and will allow us to, it has a swing there that when we counterclockwise, it pulls away from the date wheel, and of course when we counterclockwise, it rocks into the date wheel. So you can see kind of how that works there. All right, let's keep going. And lastly on this side will be the capsule and dice shock spring. And that is the calendar side complete. We'll get it switched over to a different movement holder, and we'll take a look at the train wheel side. For that, you got to come back next week, and we'll dig a little further into the disassembly of this sweet 6117 Navigator timer. I hope you've enjoyed it so far, and if so, maybe you'll consider subscribing to our little channel here. And if you're willing to go that far, maybe you'll become a patron of our Patreon channel. There's sneak peeks of all of our upcoming inventory, exclusive content, plus some pretty serious giveaways, and all for just $7. Either way, thanks for watching, and we'll see you for the next one.